This is critical thinking on respiratory anatomy. So let's look at the questions. So the first one is where you have to identify the incorrect statement. I have a lot of these in critical thinking because it gives me an opportunity to have a lot more statements and teach you how to think critically. This is a clinical problem, and the third one again is one where you have to identify the incorrect statement. So let's go to this first one and look at the choices. So the first statement says type 2 cells are present in the interalveolar septae. Now when you look at this question, it says interalveolar septae. So that means if this is one alveolus and this is another alveolus, so it's telling you that type 2 cells are present in the septae up here. Now that is not possible because type 2 cells actually are part of the lining of the alveolus. Type 1 cells are one type of cell which line the alveolus and they are squamous in nature. Type 2 are cuboidal and they also are present lining the alveolus. If they were present in the interalveolar septum and they secreted a surfactant, how would that help to keep the alveolus inflated? Here, when they are present lining the alveolus, they secrete surfactant, so it decreases or reduces the surface tension, and that's how the alveolus can be kept inflated. What is present in between the interalveolar septum actually are the capillaries, the pulmonary capillaries. So those are present here, and that's how gas exchange takes place. Oxygen from the alveolus goes into the capillary and carbon dioxide from the capillary goes into the alveolus. So therefore, this is an incorrect statement. But let's look at the rest of the choices and see how they go. So this statement which says lack of surfactant will result in problems with gas exchange. This is true because if you think about it, what does surfactant do? Surfactant keeps the alveolus inflated. Now if there's a lack of surfactant, the alveolus will not be inflated. So you look at an alveolus like this and another alveolus again, and then this is the blood vessel in between. So gas exchange can't occur because the alveolus has very little gas in it or oxygen. So therefore this is a true statement. The next statement, the upper respiratory tract belongs entirely to the conducting pathway. Now here let's look at what the upper respiratory tract, what are the structures which belong to the upper respiratory tract. So it is the nasal cavity, the pharynx and the larynx. Now let's look at what the conducting pathway is. So the conducting pathway is from the nasal cavity all the way down till the bronchiole. So therefore you can see that after larynx you have trachea and then the bronchus and then the bronchiole. So all of that is also part of the conducting pathway. So therefore this does belong entirely to the conducting pathway. There is no portion of this upper respiratory tract which is part of the respiratory pathway. So therefore this is what is called the respiratory zone. When I say conducting pathway, I mean the conducting zone. So yes, so this statement is also true. And let's look at the last one where it says whispering is not advisable during laryngitis as it will cause friction between the vocal folds or vocal cords. This is true because when you whisper and you have laryngitis, the vocal cords do not move much. So they're very close to each other, and during laryngitis they are inflamed, so they're slightly swollen. They're very close to each other, so they don't move away from each other. But when you're whispering and talking, they do vibrate, so that movement is there. So when they vibrate, can you see these two swollen cords or folds will touch each other and cause friction and worsen the laryngitis. So therefore you don't want a person to whisper during laryngitis. Instead you either want them to keep quiet, or if they talk in their normal tone, then the vocal folds will be further apart, and now when they vibrate they won't touch each other. So therefore that also is true. So this is the first one is the only incorrect statement. Let's look at the next question where it tells you this child has a cold which soon spread and caused a middle ear infection, and which of the statements explains why this occurred. Now she has a cold, so her nasal cavity is the one which is involved first, and therefore this statement that her vestibular folds were swollen due to the infection, if her vestibular folds were swollen, what that would do is it would cause a problem with her breathing. It would not result in middle ear infection. So therefore that is not what is responsible for the middle ear infection. So if you look at it that way, you can see that this is not the right choice. Then next, that her conducting pathway was blocked. Well, nothing in this statement tells you that she had problems breathing or anything like that. So that means when you say her conducting pathway, that means right from the nasal cavity to the bronchiole, that was blocked, and that resulted in middle ear infection. That also is not true, because if the conducting pathway was a block, she would have other respiratory problems. She's not going to have a middle ear infection. And third, no surfactant was being produced. Now, having a cold has nothing to do with the type 2 alveolar cells, so therefore that is not true either. And the last statement, the infection spread through her eustachian tube. Now that is a distinct possibility, because if you look at the nasal cavity, so if I was to draw it like this, and you look, and these are the conchae, and here is the auditory or eustachian tube. Now, the eustachian tube connects the nasopharynx with the middle ear cavity. So if someone has a cold and the viruses are present here in the nasal cavity, they can easily travel into the nasopharynx, go through the eustachian tube, and go to the middle ear cavity. So that is often what happens in young children, because the eustachian tube is not as oblique and it's much shorter. So that's the reason why she has the middle ear infection. So that's the right choice here. Now let's look at the last question, which again asks you to identify the incorrect statement. And let's look at the first one, which says the inner wall, or the inside of the thoracic cage, is lined by visceral pleura. Now that is false, because if you look at the thoracic cage, so let's say that's the thoracic cage up there, and these are the lungs on either side, and the pleura, so we have the pleura coming this way, and then it becomes visceral, and that way. So this is the thoracic cage, and this is the inside of the thoracic cage. The inside of the thoracic cage is lined by parietal pleura. Visceral pleura lines the outside of the lung. It's intimately attached to the lung. You cannot separate it. So therefore, this statement that the inner wall or the inside of the thoracic cage is lined by visceral pleura is incorrect. So therefore, this one is the right answer for this question. But let's look at the other statements, which tells you that the trachea bifurcates at the sternal angle or the disc between T4 and T5 vertebra. This is true, because if you look at an anteroposterior view this way, and let's say that's the manubrium, that's the body of the sternum, and the xiphoid process. This is the sternal angle between the manubrium and the body, and you take a plane across, it bisects the disc between T4 and T5 vertebra. So the sternal angle is anterior, the disc between T4 and T5 is posterior, and a plane passes through both of them. And the trachea does bifurcate at that level. So this statement is true. Then the bronchi are supplied with oxygen by bronchial arteries. This is also a true statement, because the pulmonary vessels are only involved in gas exchange, which means that, so this one becomes true. The bronchi are supplied with oxygenated blood by bronchial arteries, and bronchial veins take back deoxygenated blood. So this again is true. And then the sympathetic nervous system causes bronchodilation. This again is a true statement, because the sympathetic nervous system causes the bronchi to dilate and helps more air to go in, which is what would happen in an emergency situation. If there was a problem and the flight-fright response, you want to be able to breathe properly. So what should happen? The bronchi should dilate, and you know that the sympathetic system acts during emergency situations, so that's what it does. And also, if you think about it, people who suffer from asthma or bronchitis or anything which causes bronchoconstriction, you give them drugs which mimic the sympathetic system, and the drugs that you give are epinephrine, or also called adrenaline and noradrenaline. So therefore that's also true, whereas this one is the only incorrect statement, so therefore the right answer for this question. So it's very important again to read everything carefully and really think critically when you come to the choice for a question.